This episode of Bullet Heaven was made using Pack-a-Punch SCART cables from retrogamingcables.co.uk and with the Powerbase Mini FM from Stone Age Gamer. Compared to the NES, the Sega Master System isn't nearly as widely associated with retro gaming in pop culture settings. That doesn't mean that the Master System is any less capable. In many ways, it outperforms the NES. And although there weren't a ton of shooters on the platform, it did have one that made it stand firmly apart: Power Strike, otherwise known as Aleste in Japan. In an odd twist, its sequel Power Strike 2 is also not a sequel, as it's not actually an Aleste game. Power Strike 2 was developed by Compile, published by Sega, and released to the Sega Master System in 1993. Though it's not a part of the Aleste series, of which its direct Master System predecessor is actually a part, it retains a lot of the hallmarks that the Aleste series has. It also has its fair share of differences, additional features, and enhancements as well. So let's take a closer look. Compile is known for using and refining a very specific system in most, if not all, of its shooting games. Whether in Aleste predecessor Zanak, the Hudson Caravan shooter Gunhead, or the odd cute-em-up amalgamation of the two, Gunnak, the gameplay is very similar from one title to the next. Having already taken a look at Super Aleste already, all the way back in episode 17 of Bullet Heaven as Space Megaforce, presented by Toho. The gameplay here is obviously something we've already seen before, though simpler thanks to the way the Master System is set up. On the outset of the game, though, players are presented with a number of options by which to begin playing the game. Included is a weapon selection for players to start with a particular shot type that best suits their playstyle. A further options menu includes a sound test, player speed, difficulty settings, and so forth. Players can also switch the pause function from the system to the 2 button, which can be handy but also a hindrance. More on that in a bit. Players move around the screen using typical 8-way control. The directionals on a standard Master System pad are a little problematic given the odd square D-pad, but work fine in the grand scheme of things. A Mega Drive controller works better though. Players fire the ship's main weapons with the 1 button. Main and sub-weapons collected are fired with this all-in-one button, so players need not fumble around or tire themselves out with 2 buttons pressed at all times. The player's ship is actually pretty speedy to begin with as well, but players can also adjust the speed on the fly by pressing the 2 button. This will cause a number to appear over the player's ship ranging between 1, the slowest, to 4, the fastest. Speed 2 is a good compromise between all speed settings. Which brings us back to the trigger pause function. Since the Master System has its pause button on the console itself, players can opt to have button 2 handle pausing the game instead. However, this will also change the player's speed coming out of the pause. This can get pretty annoying when trying to switch speeds into shifty spots, so we tend to keep it off. We're usually beside the system anyway. Like any other Compile game, players will often see an enemy with a number attached to it. When destroyed, this number will float onto the playfield and players can collect it to change their sub-weapon type. There are 7 different weapons, indicated by numbers ranging between 0 and 6. 0 is a basic rapid shot that can actually be pretty powerful if properly used. 1 will engage a shotgun-style attack. 2 is a homing missile with light tracking and high power. 3 is a flamethrower with additional trace-style options. 4 is a homing shot. 5 is a linear rocket-style attack known as the Destroyer. Finally, 6 will lay down a mine barrier that not only lingers on screen but also nullifies normal, otherwise unkillable enemy shots. Like many other Compile games, there's also a special weapon pickup that will cycle through all 7 styles for the player to choose the one they want at that time. Players can also power these weapons up through 6 levels of strength by collecting additional weapon pickups regardless of type. Of course, the weapon type will change with each different number collected, but the level will remain the same. Meanwhile, the player's main shot is powered up with yellow power chips. These chips are often dropped from item carriers and clusters, as well as gray pods that drop the power chip when destroyed. Defeating certain groups of enemies will also award the player with additional chips. Players also have access to a very powerful attack. As players hold the fire button, a blue aura will appear in the front of their ship. When the fire button is released, a powerful forward-firing attack will be unleashed that will deal heavy damage to anything it hits, including bosses. The longer this button is held, the longer this attack will last. Especially against bosses, if players can hold the fire button for the entire stage, they will be able to strike the boss hard right on the outset of the fight. It's also super handy in clearing away enemy shots, just like Weapon 6. Enemies can also drop crystals that will orbit the player when collected. These crystals come in 3 flavors. Blue will enhance the speed of the player's shots, red will boost their power, and yellow will enhance the way they spread. Like the weapon pickup, some of these crystals will cycle through each of these colors for players to choose the one they need at that time. Best of all, these crystals will also act as a bullet and enemy barrier to protect the player. Up to 2 crystals can be held at one time. On the topic of drops, a screen-clearing bomber can also sometimes be dropped and collected to wipe the screen of enemies and shots, while damaging larger foes and bosses. These drops are uncommon, but can help players at unexpected times. Players may find themselves dying an untimely death at the hands of the sometimes relentless enemy opposition they will face. In this case, the player will maintain the last weapon style picked up, but will also drop to half of their level. So at level 6, the player will respawn at level 3, for example. This gives players a fighting chance to recover if things go a little more sideways. Power Strike 2 plays over the course of 8 lengthy stages, the last of which consists of just the final boss. On the whole, the game is moderately challenging on normal, with other difficulties, including those with a lower numerical entry, being harder variants of the game. A hidden comfort mode is available for players that need a helping hand. To access it, hold the 1 button and press left when difficulty 1 is displayed. Power Strike 2 was only released in PAL territories with PAL hardware in mind. It is possible to play this game on an NTSC Master System, but because its normal speed is 50 Hz rather than 60, the action is much faster as a result, making things more difficult for NTSC players. As a compile game, Power Strike 2 is actually more fun than most of their efforts. The weapons are fun to use, the action is frenetic without being overwhelming, and the overall flow feels great. With its forgiving extend score and additional life pickups, anybody should be able to jump in and have a very good, and worthwhile, time blasting away alternate 1930s air pirates. There isn't a ton to the scoring in Power Strike 2, simply grabbing any pickup and destroying any enemy will raise the score. Each boss also has a bounty that can be found on their wanted poster before every stage. This dollar amount is converted to points and added to the score when they are defeated. Power Strike 2 also has an audible indicator for when players surpass their high score. The high score can be found at the game start menu as well. Of course, given that there is no battery backup, this score is lost when the player turns off the game. So grabbing a camera may be the best way to rank in on a forum of the player's choice. It's simple, but it doesn't get in the way of the gameplay, which, in all honesty, is the main focus here. Power Strike 2's main identity comes from its presentation. It has strengths and weaknesses, but on the whole, this game is a great example of what the Master System can do. As a Master System game, Power Strike 2 looks fantastic. It has a much wider range of colors than any NES shooting game we've taken a look at so far, and a lot is going on at any given time that runs at a silky smooth 50 frames per second. There's a bit of flicker here and a touch of slowdown there, but not a ton, and no enemy shots are really lost in the process. Add to that a sweet opening sequence and great character and ship design, and Power Strike 2 shines. The play area is a little squished though, almost like it should be widescreen, but isn't. Being that this is a PAL-only game though, this is typical, and in the end, we don't mind it especially much. The sound isn't quite as impressive as the visuals though. Power Strike 2's music is PSG only, leaving it a little on the flat side, especially compared to the first Power Strike or Aleste, depending on the version and region. Its lack of FM sound leaves a bit to be desired. Of course, there was no way to access such sound in the Western market, so this can be easily explained. But, as it stands, many NES shooting games beat Power Strike 2's musical sound. That's not to say that the music is bad though, the compositions themselves are actually some of the best Compile has done. Arpeggio heavy with a snappy tempo in substages, one could imagine a piece with shredding guitar. Others have a decidedly reflective tone, reminiscent of some of Koichi Sugiyama's work in Dragon Quest. And then, one area that works really well is Power Strike 2's sound effects, featuring a ton of different explosion types. Some collision effects can be a bit grating, especially versus bosses, but everything else works very, very well. The story is definitely a departure from Aleste. Power Strike 2 takes place in a post-Depression 1930s Italy. The technology doesn't exactly fit the era, but that doesn't keep things from looking cool throughout the game. While we're on the topic of the story, it's odd to see the term pot hunter rather than something like bounty hunter. Maybe it was a space thing. Rounding out the presentation is a set of simple, easy-to-follow menus and a simple interface that keeps things clean and easy to follow mid-game. So, how does Power Strike 2 stack up? Let's take a look. Despite only a D-pad, 2 buttons, and the pause button found on the console itself rather than the controller, Power Strike 2 controls exceptionally well. For new players, Power Strike 2 is manageable. For veterans, there's all kinds of ways to make the game harder. And for those that need a bit more help seeing the game through on one credit, a hidden comfort mode has you covered. A perfect challenge for everyone. With 8 stages and plenty of options and weapons to experiment with, Power Strike 2 has some great staying power. The score doesn't add much to its replayability though. Some of the best 8-bit visuals in a shooting game can be found right here. Large bosses and tons of action don't slow the game down throughout just about the entire playthrough. The PSG sound used in Power Strike 2 isn't ideal, but the music and sound effects are still great. Cramming a game like Power Strike 2 into the confines of a 2-button setup, and well at that, is impressive. Meanwhile, the evolution of the Aleste formula without being an Aleste game makes it one to play even if it's technically not a part of the series. Here's the thing about Power Strike 2, it's definitely not cheap. Even loose, it's one of the more expensive games to procure for the PAL Master System thanks to its late release, exclusive regions, and reduced print run. Australian versions look a bit different, but still command a very high premium. Power Strike 2 was a game that we thought was going to be much harder to get than it was, thanks to a good friend in New Zealand in the right place at the right time. We can say for certain that Power Strike 2 is one of Compile's finest efforts. If players that prefer to play originals like us can find it for a reasonable price, loose or otherwise, they should do their best to get it. Power Strike 2 gets a 4.75 out of 5. Copies of Power Strike 2 can be found at auction for ludicrous amounts of money. Is it really worth it? That's up to you. We can't let this one go without a very special thanks to Cyanide Breath Mints for helping us get this copy of Power Strike 2. It's a little late, but we're glad we finally got to review this amazing game. We're coming to the end of Series 10, but we still have a bit of unfinished business on Bullet Heaven. I've been crushed by work again, so it's time to put the pedal to the metal. It's going to be fast and furious, but we still have more reviews slated for this month. See you in the next episode.